how do we know a text is philosophical? And in the draft I have in front of me, you go on to say here, this may seem like an obvious question. A philosophical text is one that employs arguments and so forth. Now this whole question of, this seems to me a very interesting question. How we define what a philosophical text is, and you spent some time talking about this. I began to think, you also quoted Jay, I believe, where he talks about an inconsistent, though not incoherent perspective. And for Jay, this works as a matter of, this is a philosophical issue and an issue of argumentation. But I started thinking, so what is left when we talk about an inconsistent, though incoherent perspective? And it struck me that such a perspective could be construed as a narrative perspective. And I went from there to thinking about, well, what is argument? Argument also could be construed as a form of narrative. In other words, argument is a particular way of telling a story. And what is the point of telling a story? Well, the point of telling a good story is to draw the person in. The person who's listening to the story or reading the story gets drawn into the world of the story. So these are things I was thinking about also in the context of the remarks you made towards the end of your paper, Sarah, on memorization and meter. This is something I had been thinking about in some writing I've been working on myself. Why are these texts written in meter? The karakas themselves. And of course, one of the ways I'd grown accustomed to thinking about that is that, oh, well, that makes them easy to memorize at a time when you're not having the text in front of you and so forth. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. I mean, once the text is memorized, it becomes a part of you. It can be used, for instance, in meditative techniques when you're not reading. But there's also meter as a form of poetry. I mean, we think of meter as a poetic device. So I began to think again, here are these links to what is philosophy. Philosophy, and where are the borders between philosophy and narrative and poetry? I mean, how do we define these things? So this was part of the thoughts. That led to, I also made a note here from there, to this issue of reading as a spiritual exercise. This is something we've talked about, something that Sarah, of course, you mentioned in your paper. That is a text as a tool for a personal transformation or spiritual transformation in some sense. This seems interesting to me and perhaps a fruitful way to begin to kind of put together Jay's and my perspective on reading. And that brings up the whole issue of reading in different contexts, especially ritual contexts and so forth. One last thing I just mentioned here, I had a conversation over dinner last night. Reiko was sitting near me and some others. And I mentioned that I have taught in recent years a course at my college in a 4-week January term we have on the Sankhya tradition, Sankhya yoga tradition. And that we read Patanjali and we read the Sankhya Karakas. And that I do this in trying to cook up a course that works in a 4-week semester, 2 to 3 hours a day. I mean, I can't sit there and lecture for that period of time without boring students silly every day for 3 hours. So what I did is I started having students, I brought in a yoga teacher, a hatha yoga teacher for a little bit of that time every week. We do some hatha yoga. We talk about how the hatha yoga fits into the yoga tradition. We do some sitting, and I asked them to, and I kind of contextualize that in the reading of the text. Well, I'm crossing some boundaries here that Reiko was saying at Dartmouth they wouldn't even let her cross, you know, and that got me thinking about this. I mean, I get away with this, but I'm not telling anybody what I'm doing. But nevertheless, this is the issue of context. I mean, how we read a text is the same to sit in a classroom and read Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras, or to do something like what I'm experimenting with doing, which, by the way, I find out really gets students interested in talking about a text that would otherwise seem arcane, to say the least. Reason undermines and subverts itself. This non-conceptual state that you're referring to, I mean, the question of what is this state and how is such a non-conceptual state best communicated, whether that happens through reason or the appearance of reason. Is the appearance of reason sufficient to communicate a non-conceptual state? If so, do we need real arguments, or our fictional arguments work just as well? Again, now I'm thinking, since the borderline between argument and narrative, once we look at argument as a form of narrative, the whole question begins to break down. I mean, it's so perhaps this is a direction we
I don't want to touch the question of narrative and argument right now, but I'm going to leave that for others. I'll only register that you've put your finger on one more place where we disagree, that I think there's a fundamental difference between those as forms of rhetoric and uses of language. But I found Sarah's talk extremely rich, just full of ideas, and I'm not going to even try to hit everything that excited me. But one that did was a lot of what you talked about at the end in terms of textual practice and what it is to think of doing things with these texts and what was done with these texts historically. And it got me thinking about another issue that joins and divides Sandy and me. And that is that we both kind of learn from Gadamer and Davidson this kind of anticipation of perfection or principle of charity in reading. And one of the nice things about seeing how that plays out in our work is how empty that principle is. Because when you anticipate perfection, it's your own perfection you anticipate, right? And so that ends up being a kind of hollow regulative ideal. But I thought about how you give a little more content to that in actual hermeneutical practice. And one way is, and one kind of constraint, is thinking not about texts, but about textual practices and sequences of texts in traditions. And this is not by any means to disagree with Sarah, but to agree. I think that one of the most salient textual practices that I find inspirational in the Indian and the Tibetan and indeed in the Chinese tradition is the practice of commentary. And that's a practice which is extraordinarily well developed in those scholastic traditions with its own kind of canon and its own way of revealing meaning, sometimes stabilizing meaning, sometimes destabilizing meaning, sometimes creating new meaning. And that's a practice with which I like to think that we're kind of, in continuity. That's not to say that when Sandy writes about Madhyamaka Avatara or I write about Mula Madhyamaka Karika that we're channeling Chandrakirti. I hope that neither of us is succeeding in doing that, or I even hope more that neither of us is deluding ourselves into this thinking that we're doing that. But that we are we're doing we're playing the same game. We're playing the same game, 1,500 years later, and that's appropriate because it's a long game. But that the looking at what the canons are of intertextuality and of textual practice allows us, if not to do everything that classical Indian philosophers would do with these texts. I rarely memorize, though I make my students do it sometimes. And there's a whole lot of other things we don't do. We don't propitiate deities. On the other hand, what we do is that nice old practice of putting a root text in the middle and a commentary on the left and a sub-commentary on the right and a couple of different translations and rolling up our sleeves and saying, wow, a whole lot of text whose relationships we need to figure out, not just to do history, not just to figure out how that tradition articulates, but to learn from that history what might be in those texts that we haven't seen, and to give us a clue to what somebody else might not have seen yet, even a paraconsistent logic, even a five-valued paraconsistent logic. So I've got no problem with the weird anachronisms that we introduce, so long as we introduce them in the context of a practice that doesn't feel entirely anachronistic. And this is, again, not to disagree with you, but to agree that reflection on the whole context can help. I mean, that's part of the reason that in that reply to Sandy, that that in Journal of Indian Philosophy, that I kind of beat you up with Yukta Shastika, right? Because I say, look, if you're going to interpret this text, the intertextuality requires you to look at a text that explicitly valorizes analysis and argument, and that has a verti that explicitly valorizes argument, and to say, look at this text, but you're not interpreting it unless you look at it in the context of a textual practice that almost always involves a whole bunch of books on the table at once. And I guess I think that's a really important practice for us to think about, that kind of textual holism.
I'm wondering what exactly the cash value of saying this is not a real argument is. And so let's take the following example. And this is actually, take the real case of the Indian mathematician who has these mathematical theorems revealed to him by his yidam, and then he later publishes them. So what we want to say that, what does it mean to say, okay, the theorem is not real? Do we want to say, well, either the published theorem is not real, or do we want to say, okay, there are two different theorems. There's the dream theorem, and then there's the theorem in the journal, and they're two different things, and one is real and one is not. Then, of course, the problem is they seem to say the very same thing, and that's all there is to, and these I would think are the identity criteria for theorems, that they say the same thing. So I'm just wondering how you would spell out this case when you say, okay, so the argument in the dream is not real. So which position you would go for?
For me, the value of citing these various examples of how we understand, how we think about argument as argument, what I called a real argument, was really to problematize our use of the term real, or at least to try to problematize our use of the term real. And the reason I was trying to do that is because that seemed to me one of the things going on with Nagarjuna. So that doesn't really answer your question, though. I mean, where is the problem lie, if there's a problem at all? When one moves a mathematical theorem from the dream to the waking state, it seems like something has been moved, doesn't it? What exactly?
Well, it seems to be the case that, I mean, there are very few things you can actually move from a dream into another level of reality. And I mean, it's not ships and shoes, but it is things like poems and inventions and theorems and so on. So in this case, of course, I mean, I know exactly what you say. Last night in my dream I ate a strawberry, but it wasn't real. Yeah, if you understand that. But if you then go to things where it seems to be the case that we can move them, then I'm no longer sure what it actually means to say they're not real.
Right. Well, I'm also thinking now, as I listen to you speak, okay, what is real in all of this? What can we even say is real in all this? And this brings me back to the notion of spiritual transformation, or whatever, whatever phrase you used that you were talking about. I mean, that seems to be someplace where Jay and I, some kind of common ground here. I mean, the text is, reading the text is a form of transformation. I mean, whether this happens through the effort to reason oneself out of reason, or in some other fashion by being alive to being brought into a world, as I've tried to capture it. I mean, maybe it's that process of transformation that's the only thing we can talk about that really matters in all of this, and therefore is the only reality. And all the rest of it is something, a device to achieve the reality of that transformation.
Regarding the points that were just made, my thought is that it's less interesting whether a mathematical theorem that someone dreams is real or not real. What's interesting is it a good mathematical theorem or not? Someone could have a dream of a mathematical theorem of a right triangle wherein a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's interesting. Or they could dream that a squared plus b squared equals c cubed. That's interesting too, but not mathematically for the same reasons.
I mean, to me, again, the question about is it real or not, is an argument real or not, it doesn't seem to be the question. The question is, what is an argument? What does it do? And that goes back to the question of transformation. And it really be cute. That sort of ties together the importance of compassion and reason.